CAT8
is a group of Jain individuals and professionals
who are assisting the community at large
during the COVID-19 crisis.
CAT8 began just before the COVID-19 crisis,
when it held a can challenge,
where children created iconic monuments
using cans of food. It raised some 3 tons of canned food,
enough supplies for 4 months.
for the Watford Food Bank,
run by the Trussell Trust.
During the COVID-19 crisis,
CAT8 is helping the elderly, the vulnerable,
Those in isolation and key workers.
with meals and essential shopping.
help with medicine collection
and someone to talk to.
whilst coping with isolation.
CAT8 is organising webinars,
imparting information and creating awareness.
A range of topics
for all age groups.
In addition, we have created a business and education helpline
for individuals and businesses
that need further guidance
on the topics of all the webinars.
we also have a YouTube channel,
A Facebook page and a Twitter handle.
CAT8 is a newest network fibre,
Connecting the community.
Slide, please. Thank you. We are very kindly supported by a number of businesses to enable us to carry out our work. Our speakers today are Sawan and Drishti. Sawan has a profound interest in education and has been helping the younger generation. He studied medicine at the University of Birmingham and has sat in interview panels at the university. His company, Sawan Limited, specializes in university, medical and dental admissions, as well as university entrance exams, such as the BMAT, UCAT, GMSAT, EMAT, and TSA. The company also helps applicants with personal statements and university interviews, including the MMIs. It also focuses on Oxbridge applications and interviews. The company is based in Stenmore and trains many national and international students face-to-face and online. The company's motto is to bring out the best in each and every individual. The company offers a one-to-one and small group tutoring in various subjects for GCSEs and A-levels for all exam boards. Sawan is also an examiner in several main examination boards. Drishti will be a final year student in biomedical sciences at St. George's University, and she is looking to transfer to medicine once she has completed her degree. She did A-levels in 2018 in biology, chemistry, and psychology. So over to you, Sawan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ramit, for the excellent introduction, and thank you to CAT8 for allowing us to run this webinar. Let me just go ahead and share the screen. Okay, so thank you so much for joining this webinar today, which obviously, due to the circumstances at the moment with the COVID situation and the lockdown, means that a lot of students especially are obviously in a situation that has never been seen before in terms of uncertainty and in terms of the situation, in terms of not knowing what exactly to do, where they can get help, things like that. It's also difficult for obviously other like education providers as well, such as schools. But also importantly, I hope everyone's keeping well in this particular time of the year right now. Okay, so today's topic is actually going to be looking at how the current students in year 10 and also in year 12 can maximize the opportunities that are available right now in terms of this time that they have in order to perform very well in their GCSE and A-level exams in 2021. So looking forward to like next year. So both myself and Drishti are going to try and help with regards to providing the right advice and also talking to you about some of the key tips that we can provide in terms of how you can actually succeed. So obviously right now, one of the things that I actually find is that a lot of students, a lot of parents, pretty much everyone, including teachers actually, are very confused about what is exactly happening and what is not happening. So what it is that every day we seem to hear different stories from the government, from the news, the media, from everyone literally. And just as an example, for example, would be that the government has just yesterday, in fact, they've announced that the current year 11s and year 13s are now able to they can challenge the results that they will get this August. And if they they do not get the results that they want, then they can actually sit those exams in the autumn, like proper exams in the autumn, in order to like improve their grades if they're not happy with them. Now, previously there was all sorts of issues around that. They were saying they will happen, they will not happen, and then eventually it was thought they would not happen. But then just yesterday they said they would, and there's a lot of controversy around that as well still. This is just to highlight the fact that every day seems to be a different story. So we've got to be able to tackle the uncertainty in the best possible way. So if you're confused, you're obviously not alone. I think pretty much everyone is confused. But the key thing is to actually use this confusion and this kind of moment to improve your chances of actually delivering the results that you want for GCSEs and A-levels next year. And we'll talk about how we can actually do that in this webinar. Okay, so I've already mentioned that at the moment there is literally uncertainty, not just about education, but pretty much about everything in the world. There is a lot of uncertainty. But importantly, what it is that how do you deal with the uncertainty? What do you exactly do? And the people who are going to be successful following on from this crisis are obviously going to be those who have been able to manage the time effectively and use this time effectively to boost the chances of doing very well. From the education perspective, that will obviously mean actually trying to use all the time that you have available right now to improve on, like, for example, what you're weak at, trying to deliver the results that you think you should be getting, and there are various opportunities and ways by which this can happen. And I would just say that if anything, this situation obviously has never been seen before, but actually other people have never had this kind of time actually to just sit back, reflect, think about how they should be doing things differently. So it's actually a very, in one way, this moment can be used positively to actually, thrive and actually do better going forward. So this is normally where the smartest people actually stand out, because they're able to use all the chaos that is around them and all this uncertainty to actually deliver really outstanding results. And again, we'll talk about how some of the strategies that you can use to boost your results, boost your confidence, things like that. Now, some of the things that are being suggested and are possibly may or may not happen depending on how things go. There is a lot of uncertainty. For example, even talking about next year in terms of summer 2021, in terms of what approach will the exams actually take. For example, are they going to be delivered in the same format as how they've always been delivered, or will they be actually delivered in the form of multiple choice questions or some type of condensed papers which are easier to mark and therefore easier to compare in terms of results? So the format of the exams may potentially change, and again, only time will tell. But I think the key thing is the students will have to be prepared for pretty much everything, any scenario possible, and that's why it's important to actually know about different study methods and different things you should be doing in order to be prepared for this. Also, there is a bit of uncertainty in terms of when the exams are going to be set, because a couple of weeks ago, the government was thinking about postponing the exams for 2021. So normally they would happen in May and June, but they're considering pushing them back maybe towards July and potentially even August, because they feel that all the 3 months that have been lost so far could be, they could use this time to kind of catch up. Now, obviously, not everyone will be in favor of that, but that's the situation. Then the other thing is that it's important to think about what else may change. So obviously, things that we've not currently heard about may still actually change. So, for example, one of the things being looked at is perhaps schools may start early in, rather than in September, may start 2 weeks earlier, and maybe the days might be a bit longer. So all of this is kind of still an open thought in terms of the government's eyes, and we still have to wait to what in terms of what they actually want to do next. But these are all possibilities which may impact in terms of how people study and how much time they have to study. Okay, the other thing is that therefore, because of all of that, due to all of this, it's very important to be having an open mind in terms of how do you study. If you do study in a particular way and are kind of rigid about that, then you might need to look at alternate ways that, in this moment in time would suit you best, and be, happy to adapt to that in order to improve your chances. Then there might also be certain resources that you probably never come across, or methods of study that you never come across, that may actually help you, especially in a crisis like this, mainly focusing on, online kind of learning methods. So we'll talk more about that. The other thing that I find a lot is that it is kind of astonishing that when you actually try something different, like a new study technique or a new basically way of learning or tackling questions and so on, you actually can develop that to perfection. So as an example, when I was doing my GCSEs, I never used to learn, for example, by using audio tools or by using video learning, video-based learning. But actually, when I actually progressed to university and actually, found that these actually tools can actually be very, very useful in terms of condensing knowledge. And so I think, as you kind of develop, then you get other study methods, then some of them might be even more effective than what you currently know. And so it's important to practice that, because, practice makes perfect. So you could, for example, during this time, like, when most children are at home most of the time, they could actually be doing lots of things. For example, practicing different styles of questions. So different styles is very important, because often I come across people who just, students who actually just do questions in a repetitive way, but actually are not really aware of the end goal. What are they trying to achieve? So it makes no sense to just keep doing questions after questions, unless what are the differences between them in terms of the approach, the style, the command words, and many other factors. And so if you can actually be aware of all of them and actually have practiced all of this, then really there should be nothing that surprises you. And as an example, I can give an example. Recently, because of all these changes that have been taking place, a lot of students, especially in year 12, have been given mock exams from the schools online in terms of multiple choice questions. And a lot of these students are unprepared. They've never really dealt with multiple choice questions before, and they find them kind of confusing and very different to the traditional short answered questions. So that shows the importance of being ready for anything, preparing for the unexpected, and really trying to practice different styles of questions. Because if you can address all of that, then really you should be in a situation where no matter what happens, you're going to perform anyway, and you're going to deliver the result. Then on top of that, you should be looking at things like, don't just stick with one exam board. Obviously, for example, everyone will be doing just one exam board, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't just restrict yourself from not practicing questions from other exam boards. And the reason for that is because different exam boards ask questions in different formats and different styles. So by actually gaining awareness of all these different styles, study methods, and the techniques, then I think you would be prepared again for the unexpected and for every type of question that could potentially arise. And then it's also worth basically looking at other less well-known sources, like if you're doing maths, for example, in A-levels and you're preparing for, say, next year's exams, then why not look at the Solomon papers? It's not something that you'd normally do because you don't have the time. But now that you have the time, why not actually look at that and actually improve your chances going forward? Okay, because the questions will obviously be harder in the Solomon papers, but actually if you can answer the hard questions well, then obviously the easy questions become really easy. Okay, so we all know that basically, life is full of ups and downs, and we've got to be prepared for obviously the ups, but also we've got to be prepared for the downs as well. So it's quite interesting to know that basically, really the vast majority of people who've actually, become successful or who are successful are actually those who've been able to turn a negative situation at a given point in life into a positive. And some of the ways are going to be looked at in this webinar in terms of from an education perspective. But due to the negative situation right now, it's negative in many obviously different ways. But actually, you can actually take many positives from it in terms of improving your learning, improving how you're going to be performing for next year. And some people will actually go on to perform way better than they ever would perform if this lockdown did not happen. And we'll talk about why some people can do that based on their study methods. Okay, so the main problem right now is in terms of the education side of things, is that for many of you who are, say, in year 10 and year 12, you may not have reached a situation where your school has actually covered the syllabus like comprehensively compared to what is normal if everything was functioning normally. It's not the school's fault, or it's not the teacher's fault from the school perspective, because obviously they've not had the time to actually be able to cover this. However, it makes no sense to just sit around and wait for school to open and then try and catch up, because let's be honest, that will not happen in many formats. So in terms of like catching up, that is, schools will obviously reopen at some point. But what it is that I think this time has to be used really effectively to look at from a syllabus perspective what hasn't been covered actually. So you actually use your syllabus checklist, which are available online. You look at the topics that haven't been covered and also the subtopics within that, and make sure that each and every one of that can be ticked off in terms of, from your own learning, like by going through textbooks, by going through revision sources, or whatever methods you think are relevant. But as long as it's ticked off, then you're prepared and ready for the new year starting September. Then, yes, on top of that, when you do start schools in September, it is quite obvious that they're not just like, it's not going to be just a straightforward situation where everything will just return back to normal straight away. It's more likely to be a situation where it will be slow and things will be delayed, but eventually return back to normal. So, so you don't want to be in a situation where you're just suddenly dealt with so much pressure to look at not just the things you've missed from year 10 and year 12, but also then having to look at the materials from the new year, so year 11 and year 13. You actually want to be in a situation where actually you've done all the stuff that you should be covering in year 10 and year 12, done all your kind of questions that you should be practicing, as well as anything else that you think is relevant to prepare yourself well for these exams in GCSEs and A-levels, and then be in a situation where you're ready for the new academic year come September, because at that point I can be sure that a lot of people come September will be in a situation where they will be really panicked and not really sure where to start really, because essentially they've not received that level of guidance. So I think it's probably best to start preparing and planning and doing the right things from now. Also, the other thing is that many people, as I just mentioned right now, who are sitting exams from the school's perspective in year 10 and year 12 are doing exams that will not be in the same format next year. So they will not be in that kind of online format where you're having multiple choice questions for every single question. And in many schools, they're not even having any exams at all. So they're just not giving any type of questions. It all depends on the type of school you go to. But in every scenario, it's not going to be the same. Most likely to be modified next year. And so you've got to be prepared for any scenario. And then on top of that, it is also very, very unlikely that the teachers will have the time to go through everything once school reopens, because they are human beings and essentially they only work for certain hours of the day. They can't really cover absolutely everything. And so a lot of the study materials will require that a student be proactive and a student be disciplined to actually cover this in their own time, and then maybe ask for help if they require this. And I think that people who are not in this situation, not proactive, not independent, or are lazy, for example, in terms of the work approach, I think they're going to suffer a lot actually. So it's best to change right now if you fit into those criteria. And then one of the other big problems in terms from, let's just say, fairness perspective, is that basically right now, whilst all the lockdown is happening and schools are generally shut or shut for most of the time, private schools are actually delivering a lot of lessons online. And actually their courses right now are pretty structured and pretty effective in terms of delivering the outcomes that they would otherwise be delivering at school. So I think that most likely the people in private schools will actually have an unfair advantage over those from state schools and grammar schools, because they will probably end up covering all the syllabus in the right kind of time frame, and they just have so many better resources. This is from a general kind of perspective. So I think it's worth actually being aware of that, because again, you're going to be competing against students from all sectors when the exams are set basically next year. Okay, but the greatest asset of pretty much everyone is actually time, including for students. And time is something that should never be wasted, because once time is gone, it can never really be, you cannot really get that back. And so you've got to make sure you make the most effective use of time. And again, we'll talk about how we can do that from a study perspective. Okay, so the key points right now I would just like to address in terms of from what you can do and how you can actually improve your chances of getting stunning results next year for GCSEs and A-levels is first that recognize that, for example, right now, the time right now you have is absolutely essential and crucial, and you should be using this time literally to the utmost effectiveness, because you would be in a situation where if you use this time effectively, you can actually get a competitive advantage over everyone else and really stand out. And so again, it's worth emphasizing that children are not on holiday right now. Some people think they are on holiday, and actually it's not the case. And if you are proactive, and if you are one of those people who wants to work hard, wants to get the right results, then you should be working hard, paying attention to what resources you have available to doing well. And only from that perspective, only good things can actually happen. So it's worth being proactive, worth being independent. And again, it's very important to embrace the change. Why bother complaining? The change is already happening. So actually it's better to embrace the change and deal with basically what is likely to happen. Then it's also very important to establish the right study techniques. And I'll talk about this later in the webinar, because one of the things I find when I see a lot of students is that many of them actually end up studying for long hours of the day or for prolonged duration, and really they've not really used that time effectively. Not a lot of that information has sunk in, and I think there's smarter ways of actually studying that will actually help to get the right level, improve the quality of that study techniques, and delivering the best results possible in the shortest time frame. One of the other problems that pretty much every student will find right now is that how do you stay motivated given all the lockdown situation, whilst you're at home, whilst you're just, for example, not seeing your friends, and whilst you do not have that establishment from a schooling perspective. How do you remain motivated? Because it's quite difficult. And even if I was in that situation, I would actually find it very difficult to remain motivated. But the key thing is to remember that this is only a transient phase. It has to be temporary, and you can do a lot of good in this time if you actually remain focused, you remain determined, you set out a plan and an agenda, and you work on that, mini steps that will deliver the bigger step. And I think that will really help in terms of delivering the results. So you must try and remain as motivated as possible, and try and do different things, as well as, obviously studying, but actually try and make sure you study in a very smart kind of fashion. Then the other thing I would just strongly recommend is that find a way of actually using this time that you have to get a competitive advantage over your peers. So use different resources, use other study techniques that you've never tried before, that you might have thought you don't have the time for that at that point in time, but now you actually do. So actually you could try all these things. I'm sure that some things you won't like, some things you'll probably find are very effective, and you can then implement this going forward, and that will be really effective come the end of the lockdown. One of the things I actually stress on as well is that a lot of people actually feel that everyone will be very sympathetic, and the government is just going to say going to lower the grade boundaries next year because of all the current mess that the students find themselves in. And I say that that is actually probably just rumors and probably just false information, because essentially grade boundaries are only ever determined after exams have been set. So nobody can actually say what the likely grade boundaries are going to be next year, because no one knows. But one thing I could say for sure is that because of the situation that a lot of people find themselves in right now, and there are many people out there who are actually working extremely hard and actually using this time effectively. So what it is that there is a good possibility that actually, if anything, the grade boundaries may even go up next year, because there's some people who will actually, for example, people who have never had the time to really revise, at this point in time in year 10 and year 11, many of them are probably already revising or getting ahead of the syllabus and actually demanding to do more work essentially during this time. Or maybe the parents are actually trying to help and saying, okay, we've got time now to help you, and trying to help the children to, obviously perform and improve their kind of learning strategies. So there's a good chance that the results could even go up in terms of the grade boundaries, meaning it could be more difficult to get the result that you want if you do not do many of the things that are being addressed here. So it's worth obviously paying attention to that. Then the other thing is that actually it's important. I think one of the key things I find is that when you're actually studying and as a student, you should never leave difficult tasks to the end of the day, because obviously by that time you're tired, by that time all your energy is kind of dissipated. You should really start off by doing the most difficult tasks, things that you probably don't like actually, right at the beginning of the day, because once you've actually tackled that, once you've cleared these difficult topics, two things will happen. One, you'll feel really motivated that actually you've done the difficult topics really well and got them cleared. So now you can actually not relax, but you can actually take it a bit more easier for the rest of the day, but still obviously do some work. And also the other situation is that by tackling the most difficult topics at the start of the day and doing it well, the other thing that would actually happen is it could have a knock-on effect on the simpler tasks, which you could actually do much, much quicker and much more effectively. So that's what I would recommend. And it's also very important that you try. One of the things I find students doing is they study one subject per day, for example, and cover many different topics on a subject in one day. And I find that to be, really unproductive, because I've never heard, from a scientific perspective, how somebody could concentrate for such a long duration of time on one subject. It's actually more effective to be doing multiple subjects in a day, and that will actually deliver higher productivity, better results, and probably even done in a short amount of time, to be quite honest with you. So that's what I would recommend. Okay, so now what I would like to do is I would just like to kind of pass these slides over now from this point perspective here to Drishti, because she's going to be talking to you about what you can actually do during the lockdown from a more detailed perspective. So over to you, Drishti.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so obviously, like, you have a lot of time during lockdown, so you would want to be able to use that time as well as you can. Obviously, I'm just going to reiterate exactly what Sawan just said. You'd obviously been given a syllabus at the beginning. Even if you haven't been able to go through it completely, obviously because you still have year 11 to go through, there's no harm in being able to go through the syllabus independently. So you can go through each of the points as kind of objectives for you to be able to tick off, so that you know that you have full understanding by the time that it actually comes to your exams. Even if you revise all your subject knowledge perfectly and you know inside out, at the end of the day, I found the main thing during my GCSEs and my A levels was knowing exactly how to answer the questions. And the only way to know how to answer the questions is by developing an exam technique, which is done through doing multiple practice papers, mock exam papers, also, as Sawan said, doing them from different boards and doing different types of questions. Obviously, you can read ahead of each of the different topics that you're going to be getting. So each chapter that you get, if you read ahead, even if you don't understand something, you can always find videos, or you'd always be able to, I'm sure you'd be able to email your teachers during lockdown. As busy as everyone is, I'm sure they'd be ready to help. So even if you read ahead and you don't understand something, you can always email them a question. And try and make your revision as, you have the time, try and make your revision as creative as possible. So by using different mind maps, diagrams, flashcards, make them colorful as well. I know some people say too many colors is too much, but I feel like, for example, when I was revising, especially during my A levels, a simple color scheme could be like red for keywords, blue for subtitles, black for main words, and green for examples. And that way, when you eventually do the exam as well, you kind of have a key in your head, so you can kind of just pinpoint different points, the ones that are the most important. In terms of doing mind maps and diagrams, obviously those are helpful for any of the questions or topics that you may be getting. So I remember during my A levels, because I did chemistry, you have to know all the different synthetic pathways and all the different routes for the organic chemistry. And so I had made all these cards and I stuck them all on my wall, so that at least whenever I would wake up or before going to bed, you'd be able to see the whole diagram. And it helps you visualize, because you'd be able to combine your visual learning as well as like kinesthetic, where you have more of a hands-on approach. One of the main things is obviously your weaker topics are usually, well, what I found was my weaker topics were probably the ones that I didn't find the most interesting, and actually focusing on those first would help you understand, how you need to improve them, because you'd be able to get through them. You have the time, so you'd be able to spend the most time on them without getting, less confident, remaining less confident in those, and becoming even more confident in the topics you already know. So even though, they might seem a bit boring, just focus on your weaker topics, because it will help you in the long run. Like I said before, with your syllabus, if you maybe take one of the points of the syllabus as a subtitle, and then whatever it is, for example, if it's like list a process or something in biology, or any other subject that you're doing for GCSEs, you can then write a list underneath, making sure that you have ticked off everything that is needed for that particular bullet point or that particular syllabus point. Sometimes if you're struggling to, like, obviously reading a textbook and just reading your notes constantly, or even just mind maps, you might have, the time that you made the mind map, you might have understood it then, but as time goes on, you might not understand what exactly you've written. So what you could do is use educational videos, such as, you can find them on YouTube. You can even, like, for example, there was a website that we used to use a lot during GCSEs and A levels, like Khan Academy. He's got really good videos for all different subjects. And obviously going through test papers and mock papers, especially when you're marking those, you have to imagine that you would be in the examiner's seat, so you're marking it. You have to be harsh, you can't just be lenient, like, well, I know what I meant. You have to write down everything that you know, and make sure that you're answering the question. Highlight keywords in the paper as well. So like if it says explain, you make sure that you're using because and you are fully explaining. Obviously that's a lot of what you should be doing or can be doing during lockdown, because you have enough time to do all of that. but there's a few things that I probably would recommend that you don't do. Obviously, main things, don't lose motivation. I know it's hard right now. I've just had my uni exams as well, so I can understand how staying focused is difficult, but you've got this time, you can use it. You know, if you set up a timetable, you just try and follow it as strictly as you can. And don't give up, and don't be lazy either. So don't try and think that, you know, it's okay, my exams are all the way next year, I'll just revise last minute. Because, you know, from what I understand, especially in A levels, and I think GCSEs now as well, a lot of the information needs to be synthesized. So you need to have more of an understanding rather than just recall. So in understanding, it's, you know, going through everything again and again, and, you know, eventually having like a layered learning technique, so you make sure that you remember everything and you've understood it as well. Obviously, I mean, don't, you know, rely on the false hope that, you know, exams will be cancelled. I mean, they probably won't be, so just make sure you know your stuff. Obviously, you know, assuming that you'll have time to catch up is, you know, I wouldn't recommend that. Just keep on working, keep on pushing through. You know, eventually you will get through this, as confusing as it might be for other people, and for yourself as well. You'll eventually get there. Especially during lockdown, you know, being alone in your room, studying constantly, like maybe reading your notes or looking at your mind maps, it can get a bit boring. And obviously, because you're not at school, you're going to be missing your friends. So calling a friend via Zoom, FaceTime, you know, whatever, having group studying as well, online, that can really help. Because, you know, at the moment you're told that there's, you know, there's quite a bit of competition in schools. You know, obviously you want to be the best, like you want to do really well. But what I've learned is, as you get into university, there's a lot more teamwork that's involved, in terms of, you know, relying on each other for notes. And even though there is a competitive element to it, you still need to be able to work with each other. And, you know, relying on your friend, they might know something a bit better, they might have a better understanding about something, and in your friend explaining the topic to you, you might be able to understand it yourself better. You might be able to help them, you know, in reverse. Also, another thing that I remember is, during A levels and in uni now, you can share flashcards, or if you find that revising, you know, like there's so much to do in biology or something, or English or whatever it is, you can always just separate it. So break it down into smaller chunks, and maybe one of your friends can make flashcards on one chunk, you can make on another chapter, you know, and that way then at least when you're all revising together, you're filling in each other's gaps, like in knowledge, because obviously you'd all make flashcards in a different way, but at least you're not getting bombarded with too much, you know, that I have this to do. You will eventually get through all of it. And obviously this is another way to make, you know, learning fun and creative as well. So involving your friends is obviously a good way to do things. Obviously everyone would want to achieve A stars or level 9. You'd want to do your very, very best. So, you know, if you take things slowly, where you revise consistently and you just, you know, tackle a chapter each day if you want, but you keep on working at the same thing, you will eventually get a layered technique of how to revise, and that will stick in your memory more as well, and it will help with understanding. So when it actually comes to exam day, you may even find the paper like, oh, this is so much easier than I thought. It's probably not an easier paper, it's probably because you've actually understood what's going on. You know, and like with GCSEs, how they've the new GCSEs, how they've changed now. Obviously I did the older GCSEs, but, you know, for A levels as well, linking as you revise slowly, you'll slowly be able to find links between each of the topics. And this would greatly help, you know, if you have essay questions, for example, or like even in just answering questions in your paper, when you find links between different topics, you know that, oh, I understand this. Okay, so this is how this links to this. And then it makes things a lot clearer as well. And you can see a much clearer pattern. Getting an exam technique, like I said before, you know, using past papers, using, you know, different boards, questions as well. They may not necessarily all be related to your board, but the type of questions, how they ask them, the level of difficulty, it could just provide a further insight into how you're supposed to answer questions. And obviously this probably sounds like a lot of information, you know, but the key thing is, you know, stay calm, stay focused, and obviously try and stick to a timetable, because the more organized you are, the more it's going to help you eventually as well. And you won't find when you go into year 11 and, you know, eventually having to catch up on the 3 months that you've lost and everything, you won't find it too much. You know, time management is obviously very key as well, because you would want to be able to fit everything in. You know, don't spend too long on a certain topic. You want to be able to move on and you can come back to it again. And obviously know what's relevant. So in terms of, you know, how relevant the information is, don't try and read too much into something if you watch an educational video or something. So in terms of actually forming a routine, you would want to be able to, you know, read what you have in your notes and know that it makes sense to you. But, you know, in terms of when you're reading your notes, you want to know that you can test your memory, but you also know that you've understood what you've written. So if you forget a certain topic, or if you forget, you know, you're struggling to remember a key fact about something, you want to be able to go over this stuff. So when you use things like flashcards, obviously you can write key points on them or big words or something. And what I would suggest is, obviously, like I stuck flashcards all around my room, for example. So if I woke up, I would see a flashcard, and without trying to flip it over or something, I'd try and remember the key points about that like one topic. And that would really help with everything that I'm doing. Obviously, you know, in terms of, like I said before, when you're marking when you're marking the answers that you've given, you want to be able to know that you are following the correct path, so you are answering the question correctly. So using the mark scheme is a good way to, you know, obviously mark what you've written, but don't try and learn the mark scheme, because that's not going to help you in terms of applying yourself to the questions that you'll get. And what you can do is, obviously, if you feel that you're forgetting a topic now, go over it and then see if you can just, you know, like I said with the flashcard, see if when you see the flashcard after a couple of weeks or something, if you can remember, then at least you know that you've focused enough on weaker topics and you're not necessarily just gaining a lot more confidence in, you know, the topics that you already know. Thank you for listening. I'm just going to pass on back to Sawan for him to complete the rest of the presentation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much again for that. So let me just get to the right point. So what it is that in terms of what can you do in terms of from the learning cycle perspective, it's worth just basically appreciating the fact that you know, how does the brain actually work in terms of from a learning perspective, because nobody can really take a lot of information in at basically a given point in time. It has to be done in a very structured, a kind of methodical kind of format. So, for example, if you want to convert like short-term memory into long-term memory, there are certain things you could do, and some of it is probably easier than you think. And usually that will revolve around like associations when you're learning, for example. So, for example, if, for example, you're learning a very difficult topic on, say you're doing some hard trigonometry in maths, or say a difficult topic like homeostasis in biology, and say you have certain associations that you can actually think of, that is going to be like, say, something you can remember, something that's funny, or something that's actually very easy to recollect whilst you're revising. So say, for example, if you are learning with friends and say there's a particular joke about, say, a concept in thermoregulation in homeostasis, you might be able to remember that better than if you just were just revising, for example, just thermoregulation from a book, because you can associate different things together. So the way the learning cycle works, this is based on science. It's part of something called the Cobb's learning cycle. And the way our brain works is that basically we actually learn through experiences. So once you have an experience, then you will tend to reflect on it in terms of, you try and think to yourself, well, what have I actually learned from seeing this particular item, or from reading a particular page in my book? What exactly have I actually gained out of it? So you can reflect on that. Most of the reflection is usually done on observation, which is why I think that watching videos, watching educational material sometimes is also very effective, not just reading things. Then on top of that, what you can do is you can assimilate what you've actually learned. So you take on all the information you've gained from the perspective of reading, as well as obviously from watching, say, educational videos. Try and condense what you've actually learned into, say, some type of condensed note format, for example, or some bullet points that you can actually remember. Try and make it interesting for yourself. So try and actually deliver something that is interesting, that you can easily go back and want to read, not be forced to read, but want to read. Because one of the things I found, for example, through my experience, was that one of the things I always hated to do was to read very long sets of notes. I found that incredibly boring. And I always used to try and condense notes to bullet points. And I used to love bullet points because they really helped me to develop a structure. But if you can combine that together with, bringing all your points in a very consolidated fashion, then it really helps. Then once you've done all of that, then it reaches a point where you then begin to think to yourself from a very knowledgeable perspective. You'll be thinking to yourself, well, okay, this is what I've learned. Could there be a different method of actually, say, solving a problem in maths? Or could there be a different scientific proposal for a given kind of theory, for example? So you really start to question things. And that is very useful in terms of from an education perspective, because that means that you're really now getting into the depth of what you've learned, and you're actually questioning things. And then basically what you want to do is obviously once you realize that maybe what you've learned, there's no, for example, suitable other method of doing a particular kind of calculation, or say you satisfy yourself that that is really the best method, and you understand everything around that, not just what you're reading, but all the details behind it, then actually you're more likely to convert that into long-term memory, which will sit with you and stick with you for many years. So one of the things I notice now is that, for example, a lot of the stuff I learned at GCSEs is still there, like literally many years later, is still there. And I think that's just simply down to the long-term memory and how it's actually been developed in that structured way. In terms of active experimentation, what you can then do is you can then do something. So what you can do from your perspective is, like Drishti mentioned in one of her slides there, was that if you, for example, find a topic interesting or topic difficult, why not actually go and talk to, say, a friend, okay, or your sibling or somebody about what you have learned. Try and teach them, try and see what you can tell them, and they will be able to tell you that, look, I don't actually understand this actually. And that will be really good feedback for you, because if somebody cannot understand what you're saying, then you haven't probably learned your stuff either well, or you're not communicating your findings really well. And so that's really important to know. And then until you can master that, then you actually have satisfied again yourself that you have done something really well. So this learning cycle is really important. And if you do this rigorously, I think you'll convert anything to a long-term memory. A lot of the times, many students I see have what we call very short-term memory. They revise things, they know it today, they know it tomorrow. You ask them the same topic like 4 weeks later, and basically it's all gone, basically. And they'll say that they want time to revise and so on. I'm sure everyone kind of can associate with what I'm saying. Okay, so the study cycle is always based on something that looks a little bit like this. So what you actually have to do is that when you are studying a new topic, it's very important that you look at different materials, different sources, because every source is different, and there's no one source that just has everything. So I know that Drishti has talked about like Khan Academy. There's many other useful sources, including Khan Academy. But there's no single source that I've ever identified that actually tells you about everything. So what makes more sense is to use all these different materials, condense information from them into bullet points or whatever methods you see fit. That will really help you to grasp the subject in a much better way. Then that's kind of formulating your condensed notes. Then what you do is you go on to sit down and revise it, memorize it. Okay. Then what you then end up doing is, say by the end of the day, you want to test your memory again, maybe not at the end of the day, but say 2 weeks later or a couple of days later, you actually want to test your memory, because you want to check whatever I actually learned from this, can I still recollect information a couple of days later? If you can, then that's obviously good for you. That's a bonus, in fact. And then you can try and do the same experiment. Can I recollect what I learned 6 weeks ago, then 8 weeks ago, and so on and so forth? By the time you hit the 12-week stage, and usually 12 weeks, I would say, then what happens is that information, if you can still remember it in the accurate format, then I think that will sit with you for life, really. I don't think you'll ever forget that. And I think that is now going into the long-term memory from a psychological perspective, and a neurological perspective as well. Then what happens is once you've been able to recollect, retrieve all this information, that is fantastic, obviously, because obviously who wouldn't want a good long-term memory? But basically, then the next thing, and this is very important, is I think Drishti mentioned or touched upon this, is that nowadays the exams are very, very different to, say, before. And there's a lot of focus on application. So yeah, everyone can regurgitate information and facts and what they've learned. But the most important thing is, how do you apply that knowledge to a completely different situation, a completely something they have never seen before. Literally, it could come up in an exam question. And really, this is the point at which I find, from my tutoring experience, I find that a lot of the good students, the excellent students, will stand out, and a lot of the students who are just average or good but not great, they will actually falter, because when you spring surprises on people, then that is when you realize that actually how well does the confidence come through in terms of the knowledge they've gained. How are they able to apply that knowledge to a really new situation? And if they can do all of that really well, then I think that person would be the one deserving, the level 9s, the A stars, and so on. And that's really the difference in my eyes between a level 8 and a level 9, is really just that. Okay, and then after you've done all of that and applied yourself to different scenarios, which you can actually create, by the way, for yourself, right? You can actually create your own questions, or look at different sources, or apply yourself to different contexts, ask yourself questions. What you then need to do is then basically review everything you learned, right? So you'd say to yourself, okay, after a couple of weeks, you can review. Do you still actually remember everything you've learned? Can you still apply everything? Can you still do past papers and get the marks that you expect? So all of that needs to be then reviewed. If by instance you don't particularly like say a particular study method, then this is the time to actually review it and reflect, and then change your strategy. Then at that point, that's where the adjust part of the cycle comes in. And then by the time you get back to the original point, you've now developed your personal most effective study approach. And so I think that works. I think you should try and implement that if you want to try and make education as fruitful and as enjoyable as possible. Okay, one of the techniques that I find is actually very, very useful, and a lot of parents, a lot of students actually get surprised when I actually mention this, because they say that nobody's ever told them about this. But actually, if you think about it, it's kind of common sense, actually. There's a technique called the Pomodoro Technique. And what that says is that you can, it looks at how you can improve productivity from an individual perspective. When you're trying to study something, when you're trying to learn some new material, then it has this kind of technique where you study very, very effectively, like putting all your concentration into a given topic or task for 25 minutes only. After that, you take a quick 5-minute break. And when I say quick 5-minute break, it's only 5 minutes. It's not like you go for a walk, or you don't spend time watching TV and things like that. You only end up spending 5 minutes, maybe a quick drink break or a quick break, and then come back and do another 25 minutes in terms of studying. Then another 5-minute break, and then by the time you get to your fourth part of that 25-minute cycle, at the end of that, you'll then take a longer break. Okay. And the reason for that is because by having a longer break, then you really establish that what we call the scientific point of your maximum concentration within that 1.5 to 2 hour time frame. You've actually developed your maximum concentration. Then you take a longer break, 15 minutes. Then that's the time where you can go for a short walk or something to that effect, and then come back and then start a new kind of cycle. Some people also say you should take another 30-minute break if you want after the 15-minute at the end, but it depends obviously on the time of the day. But generally, this routine seems to work very well, and I find that it really delivers productivity, because for a 25-minute span, you can really, really concentrate all your efforts, knowing that 25 minutes is not too long, and really that keeps you motivated compared to somebody just say, look, just study for 3 hours, and then we'll kind of check up how everything is going after that. I think most people will just die thinking about that. Okay, so then comes this situation with things that basically are essentially pointless, things you should not do, because it really kills education. It really doesn't make education fun and really makes it boring. So as Drishti kind of mentioned, revising mark schemes. A number of students always tell me that actually they've been advised to just learn the mark scheme by their teachers, by other sources. Just learn the mark scheme and you will never go wrong. And my advice to that is that first, that will make your life as miserable as possible if you want to try and memorize mark schemes. Secondly, mark schemes are continuously evolving and changing, so it makes no sense to do that. Thirdly, when you try and revise a mark scheme, you're already actually entering into the zone where you cannot apply yourself. Because as I mentioned, these days, exams are based on application. So if I throw a new scenario at you and you have just revised a mark scheme, then you'll be essentially throwing me a general answer, which is not good enough for the application that is in hand. So don't bother revising mark schemes. It will do you more harm than good. And it's important to obviously be creative. Okay, the other thing is that students are very good at, pretty much all students are very good at going to new topics very quickly. They want to see the back of an old topic, as quickly as possible. However, what I would say is that it is very important that you do go back over work that you've already done, because if you don't, that will never become long-term memory, and you need to probably do multiple cycles of that, like going over previous work you've done. Usually by the third or fourth cycle, you will embed that into your longer-term memory. Okay, so it's worth developing that routine. Obviously, it's difficult. It's not exactly the most exciting thing, but it is necessary to formulate the long-term memory. Okay, then basically a lot of people I think will fit into the category where they are actually last-minute revisers. Okay, and I think revising at the end is never really effective, because whatever you learn at that point is always going to be ever short-term. It will never ever be long-term. And leaving it to the last minute means you must be very misorganized, and really doesn't speak volumes of your, like personality and character. Then the other thing I would say is that you have to cross-check your syllabus, because different syllabi can be different, but usually the general points are the same. But essentially, it's important to cross-check your syllabus, because sometimes it could be yearly updates, and other times it could be things that you're getting taught from school or from other places which are irrelevant. Even from books, you can see that some materials are just irrelevant. So it's important to cross-check against your syllabus so you stay relevant. Don't just do endless past papers, as we just said, because you need to be more focused on what are you going to get out of doing particular questions. Obviously, there's thousands of test papers out there, but you don't need to be working through every single test paper. I remember there was a student who I had who in A-levels basically had only ever done 5 exam papers for his end of year A-levels in year 13. This was about a year or two ago. And essentially the person ended up getting an A star in that subject. And they were really confident in terms of getting that grade, because they knew exactly where their weaknesses were and what to focus on. So that tells you the story. You don't just need to be doing endless past papers. And then, okay, the other thing is that please make sure that you always go through any questions you get wrong, from a test perspective at school, from anything you're doing at home, because it's not good just to leave things you get wrong, because you'll just consistently end up getting them wrong all the time. And then it's important not to spend most of your time making notes, because the number of times I see students and I ask them, well, how are things going? And, what have you been doing this week? They just say, I've just been making notes. It just seems to be their favorite, kind of get out, really, that I've just been making notes. And, when you ask them where are the notes, they don't even know where the notes are, right? And suddenly, it kind of tells you that even if you are actually making notes, you should only be spending literally a third of your time making notes. The rest of the time, 2/3 of your time should be spent either doing revision, applying yourself to past papers and other questions. Really, no more than a third of your time should be spent making notes. If you're spending more than that, then your notes are either ineffective or just really boring, really. Okay, and then from a summary perspective now, in terms of, from this webinar, what we want to say is that it's very important, as we say, to stay motivated and positive. It's very difficult. I totally understand that. But if you do remain positive and you do remain motivated and keep yourself busy, then what will actually happen is you will have a really good chance of doing really well next year. And really, you should be focusing on that rather than the current situation. There is a changing learning style, so there is a changing pedagogy in terms of how learning is being delivered and will be delivered going forward. So it's better to get used to everything from now rather than wait till the end and then be surprised and then complain and so on. It is very important to thrive in this current uncertainty. Try and make as most use of the time and resources that you have available to you. And again, if you need direction, feel free to contact myself. That's not a problem. Go through any new materials in your syllabus that you haven't, for example, covered with your teachers. Go through them independently, and please make sure you try and revise topics that have already been covered. It's part of going over what you've learned. And try and make learning as fun as possible. Please try not to, overkill something, because then you'll just spoil the fun of learning. And it's very, very important that you try and keep learning fun, because once it's fun, then it's more likely to sit in long-term memory. And also the other thing I was going to say is that basically getting level 9s and A stars is not actually very, very difficult. It's actually more of a case of developing an early routine. Once you develop the right routine, then it just becomes a process rather than the end result. It's something that will happen if you actually do all the other things. And then it's very important that, as you said, make the most of the time that you have right now, because this time will never be, go back. Hopefully we don't have a second wave. And finally, as I tried to mention, there is a chance that grade boundaries could go up for both GCSEs and A-levels next year. So be prepared for that, because, this is why I'm telling you this right now, so that you don't just say that it was a surprise. Actually, there is a good chance things could go up next year in terms of grade boundaries. So what you can do from your end is just make sure that you're better than the competition. And that's kind of what, this webinar is all about. And yes, on that note, I hope that was all clear. And thank you so much for listening to myself and Drishti